It is Friday, July 27th, 2012, and I'm going to demo for you in this video a custom ROM for the North American HTC One X called Noctural Xi40, version 126. This is a Sense-based ROM, and in this video I'm actually going to go through three different parts. First, I'm actually going to show you the installer, since that's one of the cool features of this ROM, is the different ways you can tweak it right from the install. That's why I've booted into recovery right here. Second, I'll actually show some of the features of the ROM, the tweaks that the developer XsMagical has made. And then finally, and most excitingly, only 2 days ago the source code for the North American HTC One X for the kernel was released by HTC, and I'm going to load on the first custom ROM that's been built that allows us to do some overclocking. So that'll be exciting too. So first of all, to install the ROM, I've booted into TeamWin Recovery Project Recovery here, which is the recommended recovery for Xi40, and I think the HTC One X in general. I've downloaded a couple ROMs, specifically Noctural Xi40 version 126. So we'll swipe to install it. And normally in old school installers it would just unzip something and then reboot. But now Xi40 has incorporated a piece of software called the Aroma installer, which gives you some configuration options during the installation. First, we have to accept the license agreement, which basically says don't steal my work. Changelog, and we're going to choose a custom install. We have the option to wipe or no wipe. If you're coming from another ROM, you always want to do a wipe, probably a backup before. This will leave the SD card contents intact, however, but you'll lose any app data. So here's where the customization comes in. First of all, you need to select the carrier that you're using. The only difference that does is it will install the APN and some other carrier-specific settings. So I'm on Rogers in Canada, so I've selected Rogers. Next, you can choose a couple apps that you'd like to have installed. I'm going to leave Titanium Backup checkmarked. Don't want ES File Launcher. I'll take Solid Explorer instead. We'll include Wi-Fi Tether and Google Now. Second section is which apps you'd like to remove. So these are apps that are included by default, but you have the option here to remove them. Things like Gmail, Google Voice, Google Maps, and so on. I'm going to leave everything in except for Facebook, Twitter, Dropbox, Visual Voicemail, and the Jelly Bean keyboard, because we'll be using the HTC keyboard. Next, you have the section to remove some HTC specific apps. I'm going to leave all of these in. So stuff like locations, notes, mail, movie editor, and weather. Here's where you can install some of the mods for Xi40. The first is the rosy grid size. So this is the drawer size on the home screen when you browse through the apps. So the default is 4x5. We're going to change that to 5x6. There's also, you can also choose which launcher you'd like to use. So Apex or the MIUI is available as well. You can completely desense your ROM with Xi40. We're going to actually leave it in there so that we can show off some of the features. Although on my devices I usually use Apex Launcher. You do need to make sure that you choose at least one. Here you're able to undo the key remap, which we'll talk about later if you don't like it. Here you can choose the multitasking overriding. So stock HTC software doesn't do multitasking very well. So we're going to choose V2 multitasking and the option to enable overclock. But with our custom kernel we'll be able to do that much better. And finally, you can choose a boot animation. I'm going to choose the Jelly Bean boot animation. Then you swipe, click Next, Next, and away you go. So this will format your system, data, cache, and Delvit cache partitions and install the necessary files along with the tweaks and customizations that were selected in the Aroma launcher. So I'll come back once this is complete and we'll boot into our brand new ROM that's been installed. So here we are. Right now it looks more or less like the stock HTC software, but we'll see very shortly there's a bunch of nice features in it. Before we go too much further, let me just show you the versions of everything that's installed. So you can see Android version 4.03 and kernel 3.08, baseband 0.18. Yep. So here's Xi40 running and live. So the first thing feature is something called the quick settings. So you're used to swiping down from the top and seeing the notification bar, but now at the bottom there's this option called quick settings. And if you click on that, it gives you a bunch of quick ways to adjust common features of your device. So brightness, for example, we can slide the brightness, we'll leave that down to the minimum. You can adjust the volumes. Silent mode, vibrate, turn the radios on and off, activate hotspot, turn on the flashlight, which just turns on the LED, auto rotation, wireless ADB, which is useful if you're doing development, shows the total memory, and then of course you can go into the settings. So that's kind of a cool feature. Next, something that's becoming very common in custom ROMs is the button remap. So on the stock devices you get a back button, a home button, and the recent tasks button. There's no menu button anymore in Ice Cream Sandwich as recommended by Google. So what happens is sometimes you end up with the menu button here, sometimes here, and in old apps it goes all the way across the bottom. So not a very consistent experience. So what's very common and what's done in Xi40 is the recent tasks button has actually been remapped to bring up the menu. So if we go in whatever application, you can see it's bringing up the menu. Consistent, I really like it. If you do want the recent apps, you just press and hold, and there you go. Pressing and holding the home key brings up Google Voice. So I don't want that. And, for example, pressing and holding the back key will actually kill the foreground application, as opposed to just closing it. So that is what's commonly referred to as the button remap. The next feature is the advanced power menu. So if you press and hold the power key, it brings up this menu here which has more options than it does in the stock ROM. You have the option to power off, restart, but you can also take a screenshot, which will save on your SD card, airplane mode, turn on or off the mobile network, and also put your device into vibrate mode or silent. Furthermore, if you choose restart, you have a couple different options. You can do a full reboot, a hot reboot, which starts the reboot right after the bootloader, so if you don't need to get into the bootloader, saves you a few seconds. You can boot into recovery or explicitly boot into the bootloader. Booting into recovery is very handy if you're flashing a ROM. The camera, one of the coolest features of the HTC One X is the stock camera. So it has all the features that you'd expect from the stock camera. And finally, there is a special application on here. Oh, and I should mention too, this is obviously rooted. Here's Super SU is available right here. Very uncommon that you find a ROM that is not rooted. And you also notice, actually, since we're in here, the size of this grid is 5 by 6, and that's the size that we selected in the Aroma installer. The default is 4 by 5, I believe. So this way all the icons fit onto 2 screens. I think it looks just fine, and I prefer it to the stock look and feel. So there's an application that comes installed on here called Nocturnal Tweaks. And this opens up a whole bunch of other additional tweaks. This is the ported version of the CoreDroid tweaks for the HTC One X. So I'll show you some of the features that are available in here. There are some power saver options, which I guess are hidden from stock. I've never messed around with these. Some extra information about your phone. You can change the lock screen. So by default we get the HTC lock screen that has the ring at the bottom. You have to swipe it up to unlock. You can use the AOSP, the Android Open Source Project lock screen. There's a workaround because when you get incoming calls you have to unlock. And I'm not sure what disable lock animation is, but let's turn that on as well. You can change the text that shows up on the lock screen, but I think this is only for the Sense version. So this may not show up on the AOSP lock screen. And a few other options. For Sense, transparent nav bar, landscape sense, which is actually something I can show you now. So by default, your home screen is always in portrait mode. However, with Xi40, it can go into landscape mode. So kind of cool. So let's go back to the core droid, or the nocturnal tweaks. So you can turn off landscape sense. Loop allows you to continuously swipe through the home screen, and when it gets to the end it will loop back to the other side, and a few other options. Advanced power menu, so if you remember, when you press and hold the power key, from here you're allowed to control which options are available in there. So we can say turn off screenshot, airplane mode, and the sound option. And now you'll see that the advanced power menu is a little bit smaller. And there are other tweaks. The recent app style. This is the Sense recent application style where you swipe horizontally. But you can also use you can change it to use the AOSP task switcher. And there's a few other options in there. I usually set the volume steps so it's a little finer grained control when you change the volume. The taskbar, so clock options. So if you look at the clock up here, we can move it into the middle, and there it's moved. There's a few other options there, and also the battery. So you can put the battery text up in the top, and a few other various settings. My UI customizations have also been ported. Personally, I don't really like them, but they're very popular and they do look pretty good. So there's support for that in this ROM as well. You can also remap the capacitive LED keys. I just leave them the way they are because I like it, but you can go in here and change that as well. Additionally, the core droid has a bunch of theme support, so you can change the font on the device. You can use different clocks. There are different skins you can choose from, different logos for the Wi-Fi, different logos for the signal indicator, the battery, the keyboard, whatnot. I usually just leave this alone. I'm not much of a skin guy, but I do like changing the font. But I'm going to leave that alone now because if I change the font, it's going to reboot the device on me, which I'm not interested in right now. Okay, so now we get to the third part of the video where we're going to load a custom kernel and overclock our CPU. So like I mentioned before, the source code for the North American HTC One X was just released 2 days ago by HTC, and within hours there was a custom kernel up on xdadevelopers.com. I'm going to load a kernel on called Blackout BeastMode version 1.1, which will allow us to overclock the CPU. In order to play around with that though, we're first going to need to install a couple applications. Okay, so I've just installed two apps, one called Voltage Control and one called CPU Spy. So if we launch CPU Spy, you can see that the maximum CPU frequency is 1512 MHz and the minimum is 384. And the horizontal bar is a representation of how often that particular CPU frequency is used. So there's always a trade-off between speed and battery life. So the governor tries to keep it at a reasonable balance. If we go into Voltage Control, these are both apps from the Google Play Store, by the way. And for Voltage Control, your phone needs to be rooted. This allows you to change some of the frequencies. So the first is the maximum frequency. So lowering that will increase battery life at the cost of performance. And the other one is the minimum CPU frequency. Raising that will improve performance at the cost of battery life. You can also change the I/O schedulers, so there are 3 to choose from here. And there are the CPU governors to choose from, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4 to choose from here. So the governor is what chooses which CPU to use. So you can choose power save, will prefer a lower frequency, and performance obviously will choose a higher frequency. So now I've downloaded the Blackout BeastMode 1.1 kernel, so we need to reboot into recovery in order to install it. So I'm going to choose restart and then recovery, and we'll come back once we're booted up. Okay, so here we are in recovery, so I'm going to choose install, and Blackout Beast Mode is here. Swipe to install. Doesn't take too long and we're done. So there's actually a 2-part install for this one. The first is installing the zip file, and second we need to install boot.img using flash boot from the PC. So I'm going to reboot into the bootloader, and from here you'll notice it says fast boot here at the top. I'm going to plug in our USB cable, and the fast boot should change to fast boot USB. There it is. And now I can run fastboot from my PC to install the boot image. And it's done. So now we can reboot the device. Okay, so here we are booted up again, and you'll notice first of all, this is the AOKP lock screen. It still has a ring, but it's a different ring to unlock. So this is not the HTC Sense lock screen. Okay, so now let's bring up voltage control again. And you'll notice down here that the sliders maximum and minimum values have changed. So we can now, although 1512 was the maximum before, now we can slide it all the way to 2106 megahertz. And the minimum we can also drop down another level to 192 megahertz. Although it can be a little problematic at that level, so I'm just going to leave it at 384. And that's done. So let's do something that will cause a little bit of CPU usage, you know, swipe around a bit and whatnot. Now let's go back into CPU Spy. And we can see that we've already started using the 2106 megahertz. You'll notice 1512 is kind of heavy because that's what we were using until we loaded the custom kernel. And now 2106 is the maximum, and we should see a little bit better performance. And also, it did use a little bit of 192 while we had switched to it. So very cool. And finally, if we go into voltage control again, the I/O schedulers, you'll notice that there were only 3 before. There are 3 additional ones now. SIO is the default. Noop and VR are also popular options. I'm not going to say that I understand what the difference is. In the CPU governor, there are 2 more options there as well. User space and interactive, I think, are the 2 additional ones that were added by the developer. So let's go into settings, and I'll just show you the about screen for your information. And you can see the kernel version there. I guess that doesn't show up very well in the video. But it says it's the BeastMode 1.1 kernel. So anyways, this has been the demo of Noctural Xi40 r126 mod. Many thanks to user XsMagical on the XDA developer forums for providing and maintaining this ROM for us. And also tons of thanks to user sbrian12144 on the XDA developer forums for providing the Blackout BeastMode Kernel. I've provided links in the description of this video to all the software demoed here. Please leave your comments if you have any interest in discussing this, or even better, go to XDA developers and join the forum Good luck, and I hope you load this ROM on your device.